The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath by H.P. Lovecraft. Through those archaic frescoes, Leng's annals stalked, and the horn-hooved and wide-mouthed almost humans danced evilly amidst forgotten cities. There were scenes of old wars wherein Leng's almost humans fought with the bloated purple spiders of the neighboring vales. And there were scenes also of the coming of the black galleys from the moon, and of the submission of Leng's people to the polypous and amorphous blasphemies that hopped and floundered and wriggled out of them. Those slippery grayish-white blasphemies they worshipped as gods, nor ever complained when scores of their best and fatted males were taken away in the black galleys. The monstrous moon beasts made their camp on a jagged isle in the sea, and Carter could tell from the frescoes that this was none other than the lone, nameless rock he had seen when sailing to Inganok. That grey, accursed rock, which Inganok's seamen shun, and from which vile howlings reverberate all through the night. And in those frescoes were shown the great seaport and capital of the almost humans, proud and pillared betwixt the cliffs and the basalt wharves, and wondrous with high fanes and carven places. Great gardens and columned streets led from the cliffs and from each of the 6 sphinx-crowned gates to a vast central plaza. And in that plaza was a pair of winged colossal lions guarding the top of a subterranean staircase. Again and again were those huge winged lions shown, their mighty flanks of diorite glistening in the gray twilight of the day and the cloud of phosphorescence of the night. And as Carter stumbled past their frequent and repeated pictures, it came to him at last what indeed they were, and what city it was that the almost humans had ruled so anciently before the coming of the black galleys. There could be no mistake, for the legends of Dreamland are generous and profuse. Indubitably, that primal city was no less a place than the storied Sarkomond, whose ruins had bleached for 1,000,000 years before the first true human saw the light, and whose twin Titan lions guard eternally the steps that lead down from Dreamland to the great abyss. Other views showed the gaunt gray peaks dividing Leng from Inganok, and the monstrous Shantak birds that build nests on the ledges halfway up. And they showed likewise the curious caves near the very topmost pinnacles, and how even the boldest of the Shantaks fly screaming away from them. Carter had seen those caves when he had passed over them, and had noticed their likeness to the caves on Negronic. Now he knew that the likeness was more than a chance one, for in these pictures were shown their fearsome denizens, and those bat wings, curving horns, barbed tails, prehensile paws, and rubbery bodies were not strange to him. He had met those silent, fitting, and clutching creatures before, those mindless guardians of the great abyss, whom even the great ones fear, and who own not Nyarlathotep, but hoary Nodens as their lord. For they were the dreaded night gaunts, who never laugh or smile, because they have no faces, and who flop unendingly in the dark betwixt the Vale of Panath and the passes to the outer world. The slant-eyed merchant now prodded Carter into a great domed space whose walls were carved in shocking bas-reliefs, and whose center held a gaping circular pit surrounded by 6 malignly stained stone altars in a ring. There was no light in this vast and evil-smelling crypt, and the small lamp of the sinister merchant shone so feebly that one could grasp details only little by little. At the farther end was a high stone dais, reached by 5 steps, and there, on a golden throne, sat a lumpish figure, robed in yellow silk figured, with red and having a yellow silken mask over his face. To this being, the slant-eyed man made certain signs with his hands, and the lurker in the dark replied by raising a disgustingly carven flute of ivory in silk-covered paws, and blowing certain loathsome sounds from beneath its flowing yellow mask. This colloquy went on for some time, and to Carter there was something sickeningly familiar in the sound of that flute, and the stench of that malodorous place. It made him think of a frightful red-litten city, and of the revolting procession that once filed through it, of that, and of an awful climb through lunar countryside beyond, before the rescuing rush of Earth's friendly cats. He knew that the creature on the dais was without doubt the high priest not to be described, of which legend whispers such fiendish and abnormal possibilities. But he feared to think just what that abhorred high priest might be. Then the figured silk slipped a trifle from one of the grayish-white pawns, and Carter knew what the noisome high priest was. And in that hideous second, stark fear drove him to something his reason would never have dared to attempt. For in all his shaken consciousness there was room only for one frantic will to escape from what squatted on that golden throne. He knew that hopeless labyrinths of stone lay betwixt him and the cold tableland outside, and that even on that tableland the noxious Shantak still waited. Yet, in spite of all this, there was in his mind only the instant need to get away from that wriggling, silk-robed monstrosity. The slant-eyed man had set his curious lamp upon one of the high and wickedly stained altar stones by the pit, and had moved forward somewhat to talk to the high priest with his hands. Carter, hitherto wholly passive, now gave that man a terrific push with all the wild strength of fear, so that the victim toppled at once into that gaping well which rumor holds to reach down to the hellish vaults of Zin, where gugs hunt ghasts in the dark. In almost the same second, he seized the lamp from the altar and darted out into the frescoed labyrinths, racing this way and that as chance determined, and trying not to think of the stealthy padding of shapeless paws on the stones behind him, or of the silent wrigglings and crawlings which must be on back there in lightless corridors. After a few moments, he regretted his thoughtless haste and wished he had tried to follow back the frescoes he had passed on the way in. True, they were so confused and duplicated that they could not have done him much good, but he wished nonetheless he had made the attempt. Those he now saw were even more horrible than those he had seen then, and he knew he was not in the corridor leading outside. In time, he became quite sure he was not followed, and slackened his pace somewhat, but scarce had he breathed in half relief when a new peril beset him. His lamp was waning, and he would soon be in pitch blackness, with no means of sight or guidance. When the light was all gone, he groped slowly in the dark, and prayed to the great ones for such help as they might afford. At times he felt the stone floor sloping up or down, and once he stumbled over a step for which no reason seemed to exist. The farther he went, the damper it seemed to be, and when he was able to feel a junction or the mouth of a side passage, he always chose the way which sloped downward the least. He believed, though, that his general course was down, and the vault smell and incrustations on the greasy walls and floor alike warned him he was burrowing deep in Lang's unwholesome tableland. But there was not any warning of the thing which came at last, only the thing itself with its terror and shock and breathtaking chaos. One moment he was groping slowly along the slippery floor of an almost level place, and the next he was shooting dizzily downward in the dark through a burrow which must have been well nigh vertical. Of the length of that hideous sliding he could never be sure, but it seemed to take hours of delirious nausea and ecstatic frenzy. Then he realized he was still, with the phosphorescent clouds of a northern night shining sickly above him. All around were crumbling walls and broken columns, and the pavement on which he lay was pierced by straggling grass and wrenched asunder by frequent shrubs and roots. Behind him a basalt cliff rose topless and perpendicular, its dark sides sculptured into repellent scenes, and pierced by an arched and carven entrance to the inner blacknesses out of which he had come. Ahead stretched double rows of pillars, and the fragments and pedestals of pillars that spoke of a broad and bygone street, and from the urns and basins along the way he knew it had been a great street of gardens. Far off at its end the pillars spread to mark a vast round plaza, and in that open circle there loomed, gigantic under the lurid night clouds, a pair of monstrous things. Huge winged lions of diorite they were, with blackness and shadow between them. Full 20 feet they reared their grotesque and unbroken heads and snarled derisive on the ruins around them. And Carter knew right well what they must be. For legend tells of only one such twain. They were the changeless guardians of the great abyss, and these dark ruins were in truth primordial Sarcomand. Carter's first act was to close and barricade the archway in the cliff with fallen blocks and odd debris that lay around. He wished no follower from Ling's hateful monastery, for along the way ahead would lurk enough of other dangers. Of how to get from Sarcomand to the peopled parts of Dreamland, he knew nothing at all, nor could he gain much by descending to the grottos of the ghouls, since he knew that there were no better informed than he. The 3 ghouls, which had helped him through the city of Gugs to the outer world, had not known how to reach Sarcomand in their journey back, but had planned to ask old traders in Lothlin. He did not like to think of going again to the subterrene world of Gugs and risking once more that hellish tower of Koth with its cyclopean steps leading to the enchanted wood. Yet, he felt he might have to try this course if all else failed. Over Leng's plateau, past the lone monastery, he dared not go unaided, for the high priest's emissaries must be many. While at the journey's end, there would no doubt be the Shantax, and perhaps other things to deal with. If he could get a boat, he might sail back to Inganot past the jagged and hideous rock in the sea, for the primal frescoes in the monastery labyrinth had shown that this frightful place lies not far from Sarcomand's basalt quays. But to find a boat in this eon-deserted city was no probable thing, and it did not appear likely that he would ever make one. Such were the thoughts of Randolph Carter when a new impression began beating upon his mind. All this while, there had stretched before him the great corpse-like width of fabled Sarcomand, with its black broken pillars and crumbling sphinx-crowned gates and tightened stones and monstrous winged lions against the sickly glow of those luminous night clouds. Now he saw far ahead and on the right a glow that no clouds could account for, and knew he was not alone in the silence of that dead city. The glow rose and fell fitfully, flickering with a greenish tinge which did not reassure the watcher. And when he crept closer, down the littered street and through some narrow gaps between tumbled walls, he perceived that it was a campfire near the wharves, with many vague forms clustered darkly around it, and a lethal odor hanging heavily over all. Beyond was the oily lapping of the harbor water, with a great ship riding at anchor, and Carter paused in stark terror when he saw that the ship was indeed one of the dreaded black galleys from the moon. Then, just as he was about to creep back from that detestable flame, he saw a stirring among the vague, dark forms, and heard a peculiar and unmistakable sound. It was the frightening meeping of a ghoul, and in a moment it had swelled to a veritable chorus of anguish. Secure as he was in the shadow of monstrous ruins, Carter allowed his curiosity to conquer his fear and crept forward again, instead of retreating. Once, in crossing an open street, he wriggled worm-like on his stomach, and in another place he had to rise to his feet to avoid making a noise among heaps of fallen marble, but always he succeeded in avoiding discovery, so that in a short time he had found a spot behind a tightened pillar, whence he could watch the whole green-litten scene of action. There, around a hideous fire, fed by the obnoxious stems of lunar fungi, there squatted a stinking circle of the toad-like moon beasts, and their almost human slaves. Some of these slaves were heating curious iron spears in the leaping flames, and at intervals applying their white-hot points to 3 tightly trussed prisoners that lay writhing before the leaders of the party. From the motions of their tentacles, Carter could see that the blunt-snouted moon beasts were enjoying the spectacle hugely, And vast was his horror when he suddenly recognized the frantic meeping and knew that the tortured ghouls were none other than the faithful trio which had guided him safely from the abyss, and had thereafter set out from the enchanted wood to find Sarkomand and the gate to their native deeps. The number of malodorous moon beasts about that greenish fire was very great, and Carter saw that he could do nothing now to save his former allies. Of how the ghouls had been captured he could not guess, but fancied that the grey toad-like blasphemies had heard them inquire in Lothleen concerning the way to Sarkomand, and had not wished them to approach so closely the hateful plateau of Leng, and the high priest not to be described. For a moment he pondered on what he ought to do, and recalled how near he was to the gate of the ghouls' black kingdom. Clearly it was the wisest to creep east to the Plaza of Twin Lions and descend at once to the Gulf, where assuredly he would meet no horrors worse than those above, and where he might soon find ghouls eager to rescue their brethren, and perhaps to wipe out the moon beasts from the Black Galley. It occurred to him that the portal, like other gates to the abyss, might be guarded by flocks of night gaunts. But he did not fear those faceless creatures now. He had learned that they are bound by solemn treaties with the ghouls, and the ghoul which was Pickman had taught him how to glibber a password they understood. So Carter began another silent crawl through the ruins, edging slowly toward the great central plaza and the winged lions. It was ticklish work, but the moonbeasts were pleasantly busy and did not hear the slight noises which he made, twice, by accident, along the scattered stones. At last he reached the open space and picked his way among the stunted trees and briars that had grown up therein. The gigantic lions loomed terrible above him in the sickly glow of the phosphorescent night clouds, but he manfully persisted toward them and presently crept round to their faces, knowing it was on that side he would find the mighty darkness which they guard. 10 feet apart crouched the mocking faces, beasts of diorite, brooding on cyclopean pedestals whose sides were chiseled into fearsome bas-reliefs. Betwixt them was a tiled court with a central space which had once been railed with balusters of onyx. Midway in his space a black well opened, and Carter soon saw that he had indeed reached the yawning gulf, whose crusted and mouldy stone steps led down to the crypts of nightmare. Terrible is the memory of that dark descent, in which hours wore themselves away, whilst Carter wound sightlessly round and round, down a fathomless spiral of steep and slippery stairs. So worn and narrow were the steps, and so greasy with the ooze of inner earth, that the climber never quite knew when to expect a breathless fall and hurtling down to the ultimate pits, and he was likewise uncertain just when or how the guardian night gaunts would suddenly pounce upon him, if indeed there were any stationed in this primeval passage. All about him was a stifling odor of nether gulfs, and he felt that the air of these choking depths was not made for mankind. In time, he became very numb and somnolent, moving more from automatic impulse than from reasoned will. Nor did he realize any change when he stopped moving altogether, as something quietly seized him from behind. He was flying very rapidly through the air before a malevolent tickling told him that the rubbery night gaunts had performed their duty. Awake to the fact that he was in the cold, damp clutch of the faceless flutterers, Carter remembered the password of the ghouls and glibbered it as loudly as he could amidst the wind and chaos of flight. Mindless though night gaunts are said to be, the effect was instantaneous, for all the tickling stopped at once, and the creatures hastened to shift their captive to a more comfortable position. Thus encouraged, Carter ventured some explanations, telling of the seizure and torture of 3 ghouls by the moon beasts, and of the need of assembling a party to rescue them. The night gaunts, though inarticulate, seemed to understand what was said, and showed greater haste and purpose in their flight. Suddenly the dense blackness gave place to the grey twilight of inner earth, and there opened up ahead one of those flat, sterile plains on which ghouls love to squat and gnaw. Scattered tombstones and osseous fragments told of the denizens of that place, and as Carter gave a loud meep of urgent summons, a score of burrows emptied forth their leathery dog-like tenants. The night gaunts now flew low and set their passenger upon his feet, afterward withdrawing a little and forming a hunched semicircle on the ground, while the ghouls greeted the newcomer. Carter glibbered his message rapidly and explicitly to the grotesque company, and 4 of them at once departed through different burrows to spread the news to others and gather such troops as might be available for the rescue. After a long wait, a ghoul of some importance appeared and made significant signs to the night gaunts, causing 2 of the latter to fly off into the dark. Thereafter, there were constant accessions to the hunched flock of night gaunts on the plain, till at length the slimy soil was fairly black with them. Meanwhile, fresh ghouls crawled out of the burrows one by one, all glibbering excitedly, and forming in crude battle array not far from the huddled night gaunts. In time, there appeared that proud and influential ghoul, which was once the artist Richard Pickman of Boston, and to him Carter glibbered a very full account of what had occurred. The erstwhile Pickman, surprised to greet his ancient friend again, seemed very much impressed, and held a conference with other chiefs a little apart from the growing throng. Finally, after scanning the ranks with care, the assembled chiefs all meeped in unison and began glibbering orders to the crowds of ghouls and night gaunts. A large detachment of the horned flyers vanished at once, while the rest grouped themselves 2 by 2 on their knees with extended forelegs, awaiting the approach of the ghouls. 1 by 1. As each ghoul reached the pair of night gaunts to which he was assigned, he was taken up and borne away into the blackness, till at last the whole throng had vanished, save for Carter, Pickman, and the other chiefs, and a few pairs of night gaunts. Pickman explained that night gaunts are the advance guard and battle steeds of the ghouls, and that the army was issuing forth to Sarkomand to deal with the moon beasts. Then Carter and the ghoulish chiefs approached the waiting bearers and were taken up by the damp, slippery paws. Another moment, and all were whirling in wind and darkness, endlessly up, to the gate of the winged lions and the spectral ruins of primal Sarkomand. When after a great interval Carter saw again the sickly light of Sarkomand's nocturnal sky, it was to behold the great central plaza swarming with militant ghouls and night gaunts. Day, he felt sure, must be almost due, but so strong was the army that no surprise of the enemy would be needed. The greenish flare near the wharves still glimmered faintly, though the absence of ghoulish meeping showed that the torture of the prisoners was over for the nonce. Softly glibbering directions to their steeds and to the flock of riderless night gaunts ahead, the ghouls presently rose in wide whirring columns and swept on over the bleak ruins toward the evil flame. Carter was now beside Pickman in the front rank of ghouls, and saw as they approached the noisome camp that the moon beasts were totally unprepared. The 3 prisoners lay bound and inert beside the fire, while their toad-like captors slumped drowsily about in no certain order. The almost human slaves were asleep, even the sentinels shirking a duty which in this realm must have seemed to them merely perfunctory. The final swoop of the night gaunts and mounted ghouls was very sudden, each of the grayish toad-like blasphemies and their almost human slaves being seized by a group of night gaunts before a sound was made. The moon beasts, of course, were voiceless, and even the slaves had little chance to scream before rubbery paws choked them into silence. Horrible were the writhings of those great jellyfish abnormalities as the sardonic night gaunts clutched them. But nothing availed against the strength of those black prehensile talons. When a moon beast writhed too violently, a night gaunt would seize and pull its quivering pink tentacles, which seemed to hurt so much that the victim would cease its struggles. Carter expected to see much slaughter, but found that the ghouls were far subtler in their plans. They glibbered certain simple orders to the night gaunts which held the captives, trusting the rest to instinct, and soon the hapless creatures were borne silently away into the great abyss, to be distributed impartially among the bee-holes, gugs, ghasts, and other dwellers in darkness, whose modes of nourishment are not painless to their chosen victims. Meanwhile, the 3 bound ghouls had been released and consoled by their conquering kinsfolk. While various parties searched the neighborhood for possible remaining moonbeasts, and boarded the evil-smelling black galley at the wharf to make sure that nothing had escaped the general defeat. Surely enough, the capture had been thorough, for not a sign of further life could the victors detect. Carter, anxious to preserve a means of access to the rest of Dreamland, urged them not to sink the anchored galley, and this request was freely granted out of gratitude for his act in reporting the plight of the captured trio. On the ship were found some very curious objects and decorations, some of which Carter cast at once into the sea. Ghouls and night gaunts now formed themselves in separate groups, the former questioning their rescued fellows, anent past happenings. It appeared that the 3 had followed Carter's directions and proceeded from the enchanted wood to Lothleen by way of Near and the Sky, stealing human clothes at a lonely farmhouse and loping as closely as possible in the fashion of a man's walk. In Lothleen's taverns, their grotesque ways and faces had aroused much comment, but they had persisted in asking the way to Sarcomand until at last an old traveler was able to tell them. Then they knew that only a ship for Lalag Lang would serve their purpose, and prepared to wait patiently for such a vessel. But evil spies had doubtless reported much, for shortly a black galley put into port, and the wide-mouthed ruby merchants invited the ghouls to drink with them in a tavern. Wine was produced from one of those sinister bottles grotesquely carven from a single ruby, and after that the ghouls found themselves prisoners on the black galley, as Carter had once found himself. This time, however, the unseen rowers steered not for the moon, but for antique Sarcomand, bent evidently on taking their captives before the high priest not to be described. They had touched at the jagged rock in the northern sea, where Inganok's mariners shone, and the ghouls had there seen for the first time the real masters of the ship, being sickened despite their own callousness by such extremes of malign shapelessness and fearsome odor. There, too, were witnessed the nameless pastimes of the toad-like resident garrison, such pastimes as give rise to the night howlings which men fear. After that had come the landing at ruined Sarcomand, and the beginning of the tortures whose continuance the present rescue had prevented. Future plans were discussed, the 3 rescued ghouls suggesting a raid on the jagged rock and the extermination of the toad-like garrison there. To this, however, the night gaunts objected, since the prospect of flying over water did not please them. Most of the ghouls favored the design, but were at loss how to follow it without the help of the winged night gaunts. Thereupon, Carter, seeing that they could not navigate the anchored galley, offered to teach them the use of the great banks of oars, to which proposal they eagerly assented. Grey day had now come, and under that leaden northern sky, a picked detachment of ghouls filed into the noisome ship and took their seats on the rowers' benches. Carter found them fairly apt at learning, and before night had risked several experimental trips around the harbor. Not till 3 days later, however, did he deem it safe to attempt the voyage of conquest. Then, the rowers trained and the night gaunts safely stowed in the forecastle, the party set sail at last. Pickman and the other chiefs gathered on deck, and discussing modes of approach and procedure. On the very first night, the howlings from the rock were heard. Such was their timber that all the galley's crew shook visibly, but most of all trembled the 3 rescued ghouls who knew precisely what those howlings meant. It was not thought best to attempt an attack by night, so the ship lay to under the phosphorescent clouds to wait for the dawn of a greyish day. When the light was ample and the howling still, The rowers resumed their strokes, and the galley drew closer and closer to that jagged rock, whose granite pinnacles clawed fantastically at the dull sky. The sides of the rock were very steep, but on ledges here and there could be seen the bulging walls of the queer windowless dwellings, and the low railings guarding traveling high roads. No ship of men had ever come so near the place, or at least had never come so near and departed again. But Carter and the ghouls were void of fear and kept inflexibly on, rounding the eastern face of the rock and seeking the wharves, which the rescued trio described as being on the southern side within a harbor formed of steep headlands. The headlands were prolongations of the island proper, and came so closely together that only one ship at a time might pass between them. There seemed to be no watchers on the outside, so the galley was steered boldly through the flume-like strait and into the stagnant fetid harbor beyond. Here, however, all was bustle and activity, with several ships lying at anchor along a forbidden stone quay, and scores of almost human slaves and moonbeasts by the waterfront, handling crates and boxes or driving nameless and fabulous horrors hitched to lumbering lorries. There was a small stone town hewn out of the vertical cliff above the wharves, with the start of a winding road that spiraled out of sight toward higher ledges of the rock. Of what lay inside that prodigious peak of granite, none might say, but the things one saw on the outside were far from encouraging. At sight of the incoming galley, the crowds on the wharves displayed much eagerness, those with eyes staring intently, and those without eyes wriggling their pink tentacles expectantly. They did not, of course, realize that the black ship had changed hands, for ghouls looked much like the horned and hooved almost humans, and the nightgaunts were all out of sight below. By this time, the leaders had fully formed a plan, which was to loose the nightgaunts as soon as the wharf was touched, and then to sail directly away, leaving matters wholly to the instincts of those almost mindless creatures. Marooned on the rock, the horned flyers would first of all seize whatever living things they found there, and afterward, quite helpless to think except in terms of the homing instinct, would forget their fear of water and fly swiftly back to the abyss, bearing their noisome prey to appropriate destinations in the dark, from which not much would emerge alive. The ghoul that was Pickman now went below and gave the nightgaunts their simple instructions, while the ship drew very near to the ominous and malodorous wharves. Presently a fresh stir rose along the waterfront, and Carter saw that the motions of the galley had begun to excite suspicion. Evidently, the steersman was not making for the right dock, and probably the watchers had noticed the difference between the hideous ghouls and the almost human slaves whose places they were taking. Some silent alarm must have been given, for almost at once a horde of the mephitic moon beasts began to pour from the little black doorways of the windowless houses and down the winding road at the right. A rain of curious javelins struck the galley as the prow hit the wharf, felling 2 ghouls and slightly wounding another. But at this point, all the hatches were thrown open to emit a black cloud of whirring nightgaunts, which swarmed over the town like a flock of horned and cyclopean bats. The jellyish moon beasts had procured a great pole and were trying to push the invading ship, but when the nightgaunts struck them, they thought of such things no more. It was a very terrible spectacle to see those faceless and rubbery ticklers at their pastime, and tremendously impressive to watch the dense cloud of them spreading through the town and up the winding roadway to the streets above. Sometimes a group of the black flutterers would drop a toad-like prisoner from aloft by mistake, and the manner in which the victim would burst was highly offensive to the sight and smell. When the last of the nightgaunts had left the galley, the ghoulish leaders glibbered an order of withdrawal, and the rowers pulled quietly out of the harbor between the gray headlands, while still the town was a chaos of battle and conquest. The Pickman ghoul allowed several hours for the nightgaunts to make up their rudimentary minds and overcome their fear of flying over the sea, and kept the galley standing about a mile off the jagged rock, while he waited and dressed the wounds of the injured men. Night fell, and the great twilight gave place to the sickly phosphorescence of low clouds, and all the while the leaders watched the high peaks of that accursed rock for signs of the night gaunt's flight. Toward morning, a black speck was seen hovering timidly over the topmost pinnacle, and shortly afterward the speck had become a swarm. Just before daybreak, the swarm seemed to scatter, and within a quarter of an hour it had vanished wholly in the distance toward the northeast. Once or twice, something seemed to fall from the thinning swarm into the sea, but Carter did not worry, since he knew from observation that the toad-like moon beasts cannot swim. At length, when the ghouls were satisfied that all the night gaunts had left for Sarkomand and the great abyss with their doomed burdens, the galley put back into harbour betwixt the grey headlands, and all the hideous company landed and roamed curiously over the denuded rock, with its towers and eyries and fortresses chiselled from the solid stone. Frightful were the secrets uncovered in those evil and windowless crypts, for the remnants of unfinished pastimes were many, and in various stages of departure from their primal state. Carter put out of the way certain things which were after a fashion alive, and fled precipitately from a few others about which he could not be very positive. The stench-filled houses were furnished mostly with grotesque stools and benches, carven from moon trees, and were painted inside with nameless and frantic designs. Countless weapons, implements, and ornaments lay about, including some large idols of solid ruby, depicting singular beings not found on the earth. These latter did not, despite their material, invite either appropriation or long inspection, and Carter took the trouble to hammer 5 of them into very small pieces. The scattered spears and javelins he collected, and, with Pickman's approval, distributed among the ghouls. Such devices were new to the dog-like lopers, but their relative simplicity made them easy to master after a few concise hints. The upper parts of the rock held more temples than private homes, and in numerous hewn chambers were found terrible carven altars and doubtfully stained fonts and shrines for the worship of things more monstrous than the mild gods atop Kadath. From the rear of one great temple stretched a low black passage from which Carter followed far into the rock with a torch, till he came to a lightless domed hall of vast proportions, whose vaultings were covered with demonic carvings, and in whose center yawned a foul and bottomless well, like that in the hideous monastery of Leng, where broods alone the high priest not to be described. On the distant shadowy side, beyond the noisome well, he thought he discerned a small door of strangely wrought bronze, but for some reason he felt an unaccountable dread of opening it or even approaching it, and hastened back through the cavern to his unlovely allies as they shambled about with an ease and abandon he could scarcely feel. The ghouls had observed the unfinished pastimes of the moonbeasts and had profited in their fashion. They had also found a hogshead of potent moon wine and were rolling it down to the wharves for removal and later use in diplomatic dealings. Though the rescued trio, remembering its effects on them in Dalathlin, had warned their company to taste none of it. Of rubies from lunar mines there was a great store, both rough and polished, in one of the vaults near the water, but when the ghouls found they were not good to eat, they lost all interest in them. Carter did not try to carry any away, since he knew too much about those which had mined them. Suddenly there came an excited meeping from the sentries on the wharves, and all the loathsome foragers turned from their tasks to stare seaward and cluster around the waterfront. Betwixt the grey headlands, a fresh black galley was rapidly advancing, and it could be but a moment before the almost humans on deck would perceive the invasion of the town and give the alarm to the monstrous things below. Fortunately, the ghouls still bore the spears and javelins which Carter had distributed amongst them, and at his command sustained by the being that was Pickman, they now formed a line of battle and prepared to prevent the landing of the ship. Presently, a burst of excitement on the galley told of the crew's discovery of the changed state of things, and the instant stoppage of the vessel proved that the superior numbers of the ghouls had been noted and taken into account. After a moment of hesitation, the newcomers silently turned and passed out between the headlands again. But not for an instant did the ghouls imagine that the conflict was averted. Either the dark ship would seek reinforcements, or the crew would try to land elsewhere on the island. Hence, a party of scouts was at once sent up toward the pinnacle to see what the enemy's course would be. In a very few moments, a ghoul returned, breathless, to say that the moon beasts and almost humans were landing on the outside of the more easterly of the rugged grey headlands and ascending by hidden paths and ledges which a goat could scarcely tread in safety. Almost immediately afterward, the galley was sighted again through the flume-like strait, but only for a second. Then, a few minutes later, a second messenger panted down from aloft to say that another party was landing on the other headland, both being much more numerous than the size of the galley would seem to allow for. The ship itself, moving slowly, with only one sparsely manned tier of oars, soon hove in sight betwixt the cliffs, and lay to in the feeded harbour, as if to watch the coming fray and stand by for any possible use. By this time, Carter and Pickman had divided the ghouls into 3 parties, one to meet each of the 2 invading columns, and one to remain in the town. The first 2, at once, scrambled up the rocks in their respective directions, while the third was subdivided into a land party and a sea party. The sea party, commanded by Carter, boarded the anchored galley and rowed out to meet the undermanned galley of the newcomers, whereat the latter retreated through the strait to the open sea. Carter did not at once pursue it, for he knew he might be needed more acutely near the town. Meanwhile, the frightful detachments of the moon beasts and almost humans had lumbered up to the top of the headlands and were shockingly silhouetted on either side against the grey twilight sky. The thin, hellish flutes of the invaders had now begun to whine, and the general effect of those hybrid, half-amorphous processions was as nauseating as the actual odor given off by the toad-like lunar blasphemies. Then the 2 parties of the ghouls swarmed into sight and joined the silhouetted panorama. Javelins began to fly from both sides, and the swelling meeps of the ghouls and the bestial howls of the almost humans gradually joined the hellish whine of the flutes to form a frantic and indescribable chaos of demon cacophony. Now and then, bodies fell from the narrow ridges of the headlands into the sea outside of the harbour inside, in the latter case being sucked quickly under by certain submarine lurkers whose presence was indicated only by prodigious bubbles. For half an hour this dual battle raged in the sky, till upon the west cliff the invaders were completely annihilated. On the east cliff, however, where the leader of the moonbeast party appeared to be present, the ghouls had not fared so well, and were slowly retreating to the slopes of the pinnacle proper. Pickman had quickly ordered reinforcements for this front from the party in the town, and these had greatly helped in the earlier stages of the combat. Then, when the western battle was over, the victorious survivors hastened across to the aid of their hard-pressed fellows, turning the tide and forcing the invaders back again along the narrow ridge of the headland. The almost humans were by this time all slain, but the last of the toad-like horrors fought desperately with the great spears clutched in their powerful and disgusting paws. The time for javelins was now nearly past, and the fight became a hand-to-hand contest of what few spearmen could meet upon that narrow ridge. As fury and recklessness increased, the number falling into the sea became very great. Those striking the harbour met nameless extinction from the unseen bubblers, but of those striking the open sea, some were able to swim to the foot of the cliffs and land on tidal rocks. while the hovering galley of the enemy rescued several moon beasts. The cliffs were unscalable except where the monsters had debarked, so that none of the ghouls on the rocks could rejoin their battle line. Some were killed by javelins from the hostile galley or from the moon beasts above, but a few survived to be rescued. While the security of the land party seemed assured, Carter's galley sallied forth between the headlands and drove the hostile ship far out to sea. Pausing to rescue such ghouls as were on the rocks or still swimming in the ocean, several moonbeasts washed on rocks or reefs were speedily put out of the way. Finally, the moonbeast galley began being safe in the distance, and the invading land army concentrated in one place. Carter landed a considerable force on the eastern headland in the enemy's rear, after which the fight was short-lived indeed. Attacked from both sides, the noisome flounderers were rapidly cut to pieces or pushed into the sea, till by evening the ghoulish chiefs agreed that the island was again clear of them. The hostile galley, meanwhile, had disappeared, and it was decided that the evil jagged rock had better be evacuated before any overwhelming horde of lunar horrors might be assembled and brought against the victors. So, by night, Pickman and Carter assembled all the ghouls and counted them with care, finding that over a fourth had been lost in the day's battles. The wounded were placed on bunks in the galley, for Pickman always discouraged the old ghoulish custom of killing and eating one's own wounded. And the able-bodied troops were assigned to the oars or to such other places as they might usefully fill. Under the low phosphorescent clouds of night, the galley sailed, and Carter was not sorry to be departing from that island of unwholesome secrets, whose lightless domed hall with its bottomless well and repellent bronze door lingered restlessly in his fancy. Dawn found the ship in sight of Sarkomon's ruined quays of basalt, where a few night-gone sentries still waited, squatting like black-horned gargoyles on the broken columns and crumbling sphinxes of that fearful city which lived and died before the years of man. The ghouls made camp amongst the fallen stones of Sarkomond, dispatching a messenger for enough nightgaunts to serve them as steeds. Pickman and the other chiefs were effusive in their gratitude for the aid Carter had lent them, and Carter now began to feel that his plans were indeed maturing well, and that he would be able to command the help of these fearsome allies, not only in quitting this part of dreamland, but in pursuing his ultimate quest for the gods atop unknown Kadath, and the marvelous sunset city they so strangely withheld from his slumbers. Accordingly, he spoke of these things to the ghoulish leaders, telling what he knew the cold waste wherein Kadath stands, and of the monstrous Shantaks, and the mountains carven into double-headed images which guard it. He spoke of the fear of the Shantaks for nightgaunts, and of how the vast hippocephalic birds fly screaming from the black burrows high up on the gaunt prey peaks that divide Inganok from hateful Leng. He spoke, too, of the things he had learnt concerning nightgaunts from the frescoes in the windowless monastery of the high priest not to be described, how even the great ones fear them, and how their ruler is not the crawling chaos, Nyarlathotep at all, but hoary and immemorial Nodens, lord of the great abyss. All these things Carter glibbered to the assembled ghouls, and presently outlined that request which he had in mind, which he did not think extravagant, considering the services he had so lately rendered the rubbery dog-like lopers. He wished very much, he said, for the services of enough nightgaunts to bear him safely through the air, past the realm of Shantaks and Carven Mountains, and up into the cold waste, beyond the returning tracks of any other mortal. He desired to fly to the Onyx Castle atop unknown Kadath, in the cold waste, to plead with the great ones for the sunset city they denied him, and felt sure that the nightgaunts would take him thither without trouble, high above the perils of the plain, and over the hideous double heads of those carven sentinel mountains that squat eternally in the grey dusk. For the horned and faceless creatures there could be no danger from aught of earth, since the great ones themselves dread them. And even were unexpected things to come from the other gods, who are prone to oversee the affairs of earth's milder gods, the nightgaunts need not fear, for the outer hell are indifferent matters to such silent and slippery flyers as own not Nyarlathotep for their master, but bow only to potent and archaic notance. A flock of 10 or 15 nightgaunts, Carter glibbered, would surely be enough to keep any combination of Shantaks at a distance, though perhaps it might be well to have some ghouls in the party to manage the creatures, their ways being better known to their ghoulish allies than to men. The party could land him at some convenient point within whatever walls that fabulous onyx citadel might have, waiting in the shadows for his return, or his signal whilst he ventured inside the castle to give prayer to the gods of earth. If any ghouls chose to escort him into the throne of the Great Ones, he would be thankful, for their presence would add weight and importance to his plea. He would not, however, insist upon this, but merely wish transportation to and from the castle, atop unknown Kadath, the final journey being either to the marvelous Sunset City itself, in case the gods prove favorable, or back to the earthward gate of deeper slumber in the enchanted wood, in case his prayers were fruitless. While Carter was speaking, all the ghouls listened with great attention, and as the moments advanced, the sky became black with clouds of those nightgaunts for which messengers had been sent. The winged horrors settled in a semicircle around the ghoulish army, waiting respectfully as the dog-like chieftains considered the wish of the earthly traveler. The ghoul that was Pickman glibbered gravely with his fellows, and in the end, Carter was offered far more than he had at most expected. As he had aided the ghouls in their conquest of the moon beast, so they would aid him in his daring voyage to realms whence none had ever returned, lending him not merely a few of their allied nightgaunts, but their entire army as they encamped, veteran fighting ghouls and newly assembled nightgaunts alike, save only a small garrison for the captured Black Galley and such spoils as they had come from the jagged rock in the sea. They would set out through the air whenever he wished, and once arrived on Kadath, a suitable train of ghouls would attend him in state as he placed his petition before Earth's gods in their onyx castle. Moved by a gratitude and satisfaction beyond words, Carter made plans with the ghoulish leaders for his audacious voyage. The army would fly high, they decided, over hideous Leng with its nameless monastery and wicked stone villages, stopping only at the vast grey peaks to confer with the Shantak frightening nightgaunts whose burrows honeycombed their summits. They would then, according to what advice they might receive from those denizens, choose their final course, approaching unknown Kadath, either through the desert of carven mountains north of Inganak, or through the more northerly reaches of repulsive Leng itself, dog-like and soulless as they are. The ghouls and nightgaunts had no dread of what those untrodden deserts might reveal, nor did they feel any deterring awe at the thought of Kadath towering lone, with its onyx castle of mystery.